All right, everybody. Been a great day of Siege already. Lots of incredible information. Really happy to have Robin coming back again. We've been talking about keeping yourself secure, making money for your studio, and the great looks at the AI. But of course, a key part of many of our games is the characters and the audience we sell to. And there is a audience we have been not appealing to and a type of character we haven't done very well with, and that is the older demographic and older characters. So really happy that we're going to get this presentation on designing older characters. I think it works both ways. Put them in the game, make them feel included, get more of their money. I mean, have a more inclusive game that reaches a better audience. We're going to be doing this a little differently. I'll be sharing the slides, so Robin will be telling me when to move forward. So if anything goes wrong with it, we'll find someone else to blame. No, it's my fault. So gonna give this a try. Let's see how it works, because now I can't watch OBS at the same time I'm doing it. Ready, everyone? 1080 looks good. Full screen, there we go. And sorry, Robin, I'm gonna take the focus off of you so that everyone can see the presentation. All right, let's do it.
All right. Well, thanks so much for the awesome introduction, Andrew. I absolutely agree. Talking about this for many reasons, diversity among them, but absolutely a way to make more money for your games potentially by tapping into a different audience. So I'm Robin Coleman. This is character design for older adults, and we'll leap right in. So we'll go on to the next slide. So we are going to be talking about the audience just a little bit. So I just want to kind of introduce you to what is currently going on in research related to older adults and where gaps are in that research. So we'll kind of talk about stereotypes versus what is actually going on. We're going to basically then talk about a survey that I designed to get some information about this topic and then go over the results. And so we'll be talking about older baby boomers who are age 66 to 76. We're going to be talking about young baby boomers who are between the ages of 58 and 65, older Gen Xers who are between the ages of 50 and 57, and then younger Gen Xers who are between the ages of 42 to 49. Older adults, technically in the literature, in terms of the study of this, begins at age 50. But since Gen Xers are getting obviously already a part of this as older Gen Xers, but are getting so close for this full generation demographic to be technically older adults, worth looking at what's going on with the younger end of that generation as well. So we'll move on here. So as I mentioned before, let's get past the stereotypes. Let's look at what's really going on with this audience. So next. So I think when people think about older adults and games, they think of basically their own grandparents, like some, super old people who maybe were adults when games came onto the market, never really played them, and maybe now, play Words with Friends and, digitizations of board games and card games. The reality is that older adults run quite a gambit. When you look again at 50 and up, that includes Gen Xers, baby boomers, and members of the silent generation. And so that audience of folks, baby boomers and members of the silent generation, typically are playing games, and actually a pretty surprising variety of games, on things like laptops, tablets, and personal computers. They predominantly play more casual player set pace, mentally challenging things like puzzle games and card games. And maybe not super surprising that a lot of the research related to older adults and games has focused on the rehabilitative potential of games. And so it's really focused on old age in a way related to decline, and the way that games can help to, sort of recover from decline or even prevent decline, versus actually looking at other ways that games can be meaningful. And so, as I mentioned, you've got tons of folks who are older adults playing games, including Gen Xers who actually grew up with the game industry. So they were, older children and in their teens for older Gen Xers when the game industry really began to take off. And so for older Gen Xers and for younger baby boomers, they really do play all different kinds of games, and really on every platform you can think of. They're playing on console, they're playing on mobile, they're playing on tablets, they're playing on laptops. In terms of specific research related to Generation X as they become older adults, I'll be honest, there just isn't a lot yet. I think that folks are just starting to think about the fact that the first generation to grow up with games is actually now entering, this phase of being an older adult. And so there's a little bit that's been done that sort of looks broadly at some tendencies of gameplay. But even then, when you look at the, again, body of research out there, it's mainly about the therapeutic potential of games. So we'll move on to the next slide. And so, the major gap for me that I noticed when it comes to older adults and games is that there really isn't as much research out there on games really for their engagement and entertainment value, right? Folks that approach this medium who happen to be over the age of 50 aren't necessarily looking for or in need of therapeutic experiences. And so why isn't there research about, what's engaging from a gameplay perspective, what's engaging in this case from a character design perspective? And so there are folks like Bob DeShooter and Hannah Marstead who are out there and doing some research on Sherry Grader Ray, research on how older adults feel sort of generally about different aspects of gameplay. But there are a lot of areas that haven't been covered yet. And so when I first thought about diving into this area of research, I was like, wow, you could research anything, but you can't research everything, right? You have to have a good scope in research, just like you do when you're developing games. And so I decided to focus on character. So we'll go to the next slide if we could. And so the why of this, like why I decided to focus on character. I guess, for those of you who aren't familiar with me from past presentations, I have a background in game design as well as a background in education and in creative writing. And so character is something that in many ways is very important to me. And I think it's also a really vital part of the gameplay experience. Games present us with the opportunity to take on a part, to really immerse ourselves in a role in a way that other forms of entertainment don't. And so it becomes one of those key draws when we think about motivations for why players choose to play certain games, that potential for wish fulfillment, that potential for role play. And so, since that relationship is so unique and since it's such a powerful part of what the games we create have to offer, how can we better create characters for this audience demographic, right? Which is just getting bigger. And we'll talk about the spending habits and such a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So what I decided to do was to go ahead and actually run a study. And so working with Lindenwood University, I designed and conducted a study in fall of 2021 that I distributed to a variety of different social media sites and Discord groups.
Oh, do we freeze? Crash. Lovely. Lovely, lovely.
Hey, Andrew,
Hey,
you back?
Discord crashed on me.
Gotcha.
So
It's okay.
we'll just take it from survey results.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Yeah, my machine is being taxed, unfortunately. Make sure
Yeah,
we
I'm
can
so
do this.
sorry about that. Sure. And for folks who are hearing our conversation, just having some technical difficulties, so we're just going to hop right back in.
Not yet, not yet, not yet. I'll throw it to you. Oh yeah, you all can hear me. Haha, I didn't turn off my mic either. Yeah, some technical difficulties. Here we go.
So just as a quick recap, back in fall of 2021, I went ahead and conducted a survey gathered results. And so basically, what I'd like to do is just talk about the data that I found and what I learned about what older adults are looking for from game characters. I asked some other questions about tendencies of play in terms of platform and genre, because I think that does have implications for likely what kind of avatar we would be dealing with. And so we'll chat about that as well as we go through. So we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. So first, we're going to talk about older baby boomers. So we're going to be looking at that range of 66 to 73-year-olds. Again, I'm not saying that this is the oldest that gamers are who are playing games for our industry, but was just one of the demographics that I focused on for this particular area of research. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. So three big areas: motivations, platform, and genre. And so the number one motivation for these older baby boomers, who again contextually would have been, late teens, early 20s, when the very early days of the arcade industry began, their major motivation for playing video games now, in this case in 2021, were entertainment and socialization. And so old baby boomers are looking to play games for fun, not for rehabilitation or for therapeutic purposes, but also to connect to people. This does support literature on aging that talks about loneliness as a pretty common issue. And so not surprising at all that they would be looking for the opportunity to socialize through play. In terms of platforms, as you can see, they play on a variety of different platforms. So we have folks who play on computer, we have folks who play on mobile phones, as well as on tablets. And so it's typically tech that they are comfortable using in daily life. Older baby boomers aren't what we would call digital natives. A lot of the technology of the personal computing era and cellular era and the internet, right, has really come along after they were already well into adulthood. And so there's definitely a tendency to stick to technology they're comfortable with. In terms of genres, one of the things that surprised me was that there was such a high response for the action genre. So even though these folks are older baby boomers, they like playing reflexively driven experiences. They also enjoy role-playing games, and so we'll talk about that in relationship to the kinds of characters that they enjoy. They also like strategy games, not surprising, with the emphasis on mental skill, and then digitized board games, which again is one of those sort of common threads in and amongst older adult players as you go baby boomer and older into members of the silent generation. Next, please. So in terms of character style, so the kinds of avatars that they prefer, older baby boomers, number one was non-human characters, which that was really interesting. So they would prefer sort of a more fanciful avatar, you might say. When it is a human avatar, they mentioned a preference for a first person point of view. So where you would really maybe be able to project yourself into the world a bit more, or the use of a more stylized character. So not in this case looking for, sort of a photorealistic avatar. In terms of the demographics of characters, the preference here was for younger characters, or in some cases, characters their own age, or characters that were customizable. And this is one of those things that you're definitely going to see as a trend, is that desire for customization. In terms of the desire for younger characters, I think we could link that to a few things. We could probably link that a bit to nostalgia. We could also potentially link that, as sad as it may be, to ageism, to not wanting to be, associated with some of the negative qualities that are often, sort of stereotypically connected to aging. In terms of what they want from customization, the most popular areas of customization were things like hair color and the skills and abilities of the character. So they wanted to change the way the character behaved mechanically and be able to change the look of hair, which again are pretty interesting results. So we'll move on now to our younger baby boomers. So this is our 58 to 65-year-old gamers. And so again, sort of contextually, these are folks who would have been, late childhood early teens as the arcade era began to really take off. So we'll move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about some of the findings here. So motivations, entertainment is still number one. So again, notice we don't have therapeutic desires or rehabilitative desires here. And number two was relaxation. And so I feel that, right? In this day and age, lots of stressful things in the world. So totally understandable why we might be looking to relax. In terms of platforms, not too much different here, right? So we still have players who typically are playing on mobile, tablet, or computer. It doesn't mean there aren't any younger baby boomers who are playing, or even older baby boomers who are playing on a platform like a console. They're just much rarer, perhaps, for my particular study in terms of responses. And then genre were casual games and strategy games for the top two. I think interestingly, not necessarily games where we always would expect to maybe have a traditional avatar, but maybe would, have sort of a either stylized representation or just a first person point of view. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of character style, again, perhaps not surprisingly, the number one choice was a first person point of view. They also had an equal interest in those characters being stylized or realistic. There wasn't a strong preference in either direction there. In terms of demographics, wholeheartedly, younger baby boomers were looking for characters that were customizable. They want to be able to change things. And the most popular things that they wanted to change were clothing choice and body type. And so, do you have a big, burly, sort of, mesomorphic character, or a more slim and elegant, ectomorphic character, in addition to the clothing that the character was wearing? And so in this case, for younger baby boomers particularly, it really seems there's an interest in making a character that is their own. So next slide, please. Awesome. So we're going to move on to our older Gen Xers at this point. And so again, this is really the first part of the Gen X generation that is hitting that older adult status based on the scientific literature. And so these are 50 to 57-year-olds who have grown up with the game industry, who were kids when, the arcade and early console era kicked off, and in many cases have continued to play games throughout their entire lives. There may have been, dips, for an example, when increased life responsibilities came along, like marriage or kids or work. But folks who have continued to play and who now, as they're getting older, maybe have, for the average 50 to 57-year-old, kids are probably grown, or in their mid to later teens if they're not grown. And so suddenly, with more free time, are returning to playing games in larger numbers. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of motivations, again, number one, entertainment. Number two, relaxation. And so much like younger baby boomers, older Gen Xers, just looking to be entertained and looking to find stress relief. In terms of platforms here, we definitely see consoles becoming a more popular tool, in addition to things like mobile phones and computers. And so there's a much higher percentage of older adults in the older Gen X range that are playing on console. And then in terms of genre, you see a very interesting variety. So folks that are interested in RPGs who are also playing action adventure games that have these narrative aspects as well as reflex-driven play. And then strategy games, again, were quite popular with this particular audience. So let's look at their preferences for character just a little bit. So we'll move on to the next slide. So in terms of style, realistic came across right away as the top fave for this group, which I thought was really interesting. So where it was kind of a moderate interest with younger baby boomers and not really an interest at all with older baby boomers, it was definitely something that was a stronger interest here, maybe perhaps tied to the kinds of games that they would have grown up playing. A first person point of view is also very popular, followed pretty closely by stylized characters. So that still creeps in. And here with this audience for the first time, a specific desire to play a character that's the same gender. And so I thought, again, quite interesting, given that, it's obviously, I'll speak as a woman, growing up playing games, I'm not an older Gen Xer, but I'm a younger Gen Xer growing up playing games. More often than not, didn't have the option to play as a female character. And so when you look at older adults in terms of the audience base, we actually have more women over the age of 50 playing games than men. And so seeing that desire to play a character of the same gender, I thought, has some interesting implications for our Gen Xers and younger. So in terms of demographics, again, the desire is for customization. That was the number one ask. And so they didn't, make necessarily specific preferences for a particular age or a particular ethnicity, but wanted to be able to customize the character. And here, a variety of customizations. So things like hairstyle and color, things like eye color, as well as clothing, were all sort of top asks from this group in terms of what they would be able to customize. So I mentioned earlier, even though we're not technically in that range of older adults yet for younger Gen Xers, I think it's really interesting to see what the next generation of older adults is looking for from characters and how it compares to these other older adult groups that we've talked about. So we're going to hop to the next slide here and look at our younger Gen Xers. So these are folks who are between the ages of 42 and 49. And so I mentioned I myself am in this demographic group. And so younger Gen Xers are folks who absolutely have grown up with the game industry, who maybe would have experienced the, a little bit of a crash that happened and then the resurgence of the game industry with the release of the NES, and then really grown up through all the subsequent generations of development in terms of console. And obviously, the rise in popularity of PC-based gaming, as well as the really meteoric rise in popularity of social gaming on mobile devices. So we'll hop to the next slide and talk a little bit about what they're looking for. And so in terms of motivation, we had 3: entertainment, relaxation, and socializing. I thought it was really interesting that younger Gen Xers and older baby boomers, who maybe perhaps, in some cases it's like a parent and child age range difference, were both interested in that focus on socialization. In this range, I think too, when you look at 42 to 49-year-olds, they are more likely to have kids that are a little bit younger, so maybe older children to early teens, and so maybe looking for that opportunity to socialize from that regard. In terms of platforms, much like our older Gen Xers, they really do play everywhere. So younger Gen Xers are really playing across all the different platforms that are available. And in terms of genre, you still see action, adventure, and RPG, but here we also fold in casual games. Since younger Gen Xers, again, still, I guess based on age, not technically digital natives, but likely very comfortable with technologies that have arisen, in their 20s and 30s. That casual game piece is likely tied in no small part to the rise of popularity of social mobile-based play. So let's talk a little bit about character for this group. So we'll move on to the next slide. So in terms of style, again, first-person point of view, really popular amongst these respondents, followed by a tie, just a full-on tie between stylized and realistic. And so it seems like our audience really kind of throughout these older adults in many ways is pretty flexible in terms of the baseline kind of aesthetic approach with the character. Obviously, our older adults aren't as interested in realism, but, for younger baby boomers, older Gen Xers, and younger Gen Xers, we see that flexibility. Demographically, again, a character that they can customize. If you look at recent statistics on offerings among customization, back in 2019 at the E3 event, around 60% of games that were announced that year were offering customization. And so it does seem to be something that the industry is already doing, which is great. And then in terms of the type of customization, again, very robust. So hairstyle, hair color, eye color, and body type. So they really do want to be able to sort of fully invent a character. When you think about the asks for customization from a design perspective, think about the complexity of customization systems, right? So there's a difference, for an example, between designing your farmer for Farmville, where you're picking a hair color and an eye color and choosing between a male and a female avatar, and something like Skyrim, where you have this really deep, complex system where you're choosing between different species and or races. You're choosing between, different classes of character, and you really have this very robust ability to adjust the appearance of a character and really make it your own. And so I do think there's some interesting implications about what level of complexity of a customization system might be warranted given the platform and the genre of games, as well as the customization asks that a particular generation is looking for. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So one of the questions that I asked in my survey was how my respondents think older adults are depicted in games. And so something that I want you all to keep in mind when we talk about how older adults are depicted in games is how rare it is to have older adult characters in games. And I don't mean just as a player character, I mean at all. And so if you look at something like the virtual census that was done by Dimitri Williams and Mia Consalvo back in 2009, and then the virtual census 2.0 that was done, I think, 2020, which basically looked at like more than 100 of the games that were on the market for a span of time and analyzed character tendency. They found from 2009 to 2020 that there was virtually no change in the tendency or the propensity of games to include older adult characters. It hovers right around 2%. This is probably not that surprising when you consider the fact that the game industry has a workforce that is like 9% of people are over the age of 50. And so, first, there aren't many older adult characters, right? And then there even fewer of them are actually playable. And so, I asked this question, when you do see them, what do you think the way that they're portrayed? And so, this is the results that I received. So, older baby boomers basically said, when older adult characters appear, they're stereotyped, and any narrative that includes them usually focuses on mental and physical decline. So, sort of the most traditional stereotypes around aging. Younger baby boomers said not only are older adults stereotyped, but they're stereotyped as victims. So, helpless and vulnerable. And also said not only are there stories about mental and physical decline, but they're usually about death or dying. And so, either the assumption is that, they're toward the end of their life or that they may actually die in the course of a game being played. For older Gen Xers, they said older adults are stereotyped not just as victims, but often as villains. And I'll throw this out there. If you're a woman and you're an older adult character, odds are you're a villain. It's very rare for older women to be portrayed positively in games, which is a bummer. And then again, stories that focus on death or decline. For younger Gen Xers, we get back to the idea of older adults stereotyped as victims, and here specifically with stories that focus on physical decline. So you can see not a super positive view of the way that older adults are depicted in games. And so if we are going to make games that are about older adults or that feature older adults, steering away from some of these types of characterizations and some of these arcs in terms of narrative can go a long way to making older adult characters that are more appealing and more compelling and perhaps more interesting to players prospectively to play them. So move on to the next slide here. I wanted to talk about some things that surprised me, because anytime that you do research, you're going to have hypotheses that play out, you're going to have hypotheses that don't play out. And so some of the things that surprised me, number one, I thought nostalgia was going to matter a lot more. I thought nostalgia was going to be a critical motivation for players to approach certain games. And I especially thought if you had older adults who wanted to play as younger characters, that nostalgia was going to play a role. It did not turn out to be the case. Now, obviously it's just one study. I'd love to run another study and see if I get different results. But at least for this particular research, it just wasn't as significant a motivation as I'd hoped or anticipated, I guess. So age-related customization was not in the top 3 options for any age, which again, I thought just given the audience that they might be more interested in that ability to customize age, not so much, but 35% of the total respondents did say they would like the option. It just wasn't in the top three. So, the percentages overall, it just wasn't weighted as important to them as some other types of customization that we've talked about tonight. So, social play. I mentioned earlier, I was really interested to see that that was such an important draw for younger Gen Xers and older baby boomers, but not for older Gen Xers and younger baby boomers. And so, honestly, further research would need to be done to see if this is something that could sort of be broadly implied as tendencies of these audiences, or maybe just for whatever reason, a combination of responses that led to these results from my study. But if it is a broader tendency that's observable with repeated research, it's really interesting to kind of dig into and figure out why, right? Why is it that for younger Gen Xers and older baby boomers that's such a draw, but for older Gen Xers and younger baby boomers it isn't, even though, again, loneliness is a very common complaint of folks as they age. And then lastly, only older baby boomers really expressed any kind of preference around playing characters that were younger. For the other respondents, again, from just, on the cusp of older adults, our younger Gen Xers, all the way up through younger baby boomers, they in their responses didn't really have a particular inclination toward a preferred age, particularly not a preferred inclination toward playing a younger character. And again, if you look at the data that's out there, like the virtual census that talks about those kind of tendencies of character design, our characters do broadly skew young. And so, it's not unusual to see characters that are in their late 20s to early 30s based on appearance and ability. And so it's interesting to note that we have a substantial audience of older adults that would be fine playing a character that is perhaps older than that. So I'll move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of further research, obviously, anytime that you conduct research, it's good to run other studies to collect data from other respondents and see if you get similar results, to add to the validity of the information that you're sharing. For me personally, I would love to just get a larger sample size, maybe get thousands of respondents versus in the hundreds of respondents, because obviously the more sample size you get, the better in many cases, just in terms of the amount of information that you can glean. I also think that it would be very interesting to dig further into the types of customization that audiences are looking for. And I think this could be paired with accessibility in UX and UI design, really looking at what is, the best way to design customization systems that are approachable and usable versus being, perhaps confusing or overwhelming, but still allow for, sort of a robust ability to alter a character's appearance. So those are areas that I hope to be looking into the future. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that I was going to talk a little bit about the potential for profitability in this audience. And so I just want to throw it out there in case you weren't aware that adults over the age of 50 are a multi-billion-dollar audience for the game industry. And this is in no small part because of the fact that Gen Xers are beginning to age into that category. When you go back to 2016, when a lot of Gen Xers were technically not older adults yet, the average spending among adults over the age of 50 was just over $513 million for a year. And just a few years later, in 2019, Nelson and Kakula found that that amount had jumped all the way up to $3.5 billion in a year. And so it's definitely a lucrative audience. These are folks that play games regularly. They're willing to invest, to spend in free-to-play games, but also to pay for premium titles. And so I think, it does behoove us to learn more about what it is they're looking for from their gameplay experiences. And so doing more research on other aspects of design, like gameplay, like level design, UX and UI design, in addition to things like narrative design and character design, so that we can create experiences that are enjoyable for everyone and not just, assume that our core audience base is still 12 to 18-year-olds, which it hasn't been for a long time. Next slide, please. So thanks so much. And special thanks to Andrew for handling the slides for me so that we could have this presentation this evening. So feel free to take a screenshot or take a photo with your phone. If you have any questions or if you'd like to talk to me anymore about gerontoludic design, the design of games for older adults, I'm always happy to chat. I've got my email address here, my website, and you can also feel free to introduce yourself on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to make new connections. So thanks so much to the folks of Siege for the opportunity to share this information with you, and have a wonderful night.
Next, we do have a few questions from chat. Number
Awesome.
one
Great.
was folks are wanting to access to the slides. You mind if we put this PDF up in the Facebook group and our LinkedIn group?
Happy to. That's great.
All right. Second, we had Justin Collins was talking about. I'll rephrase it. He was rather surprised that that older characters weren't seen as mentors, and he was wondering what the options that people had when they were selecting how were elders seen in games.
I think that's a wonderful question. So definitely kind of given an array of kind of roles and perspectives. But I think that that's a really interesting point, right? In that, for my particular group of respondents, why that particular aspect of mentoring didn't come up. I think, obviously it's still in a way a stereotype, right? Not every older person should be someone who's trying to guide other people. But at least it's a positive stereotype versus a negative stereotype. So yeah, I'll have to in future research see if I get more folks that draw that association. I think there are a lot of things that can lead to certain responses. And it may be honestly, like if you think about that year, 2021, if there was just a broader tendency for older adults in games to be depicted more in that frame than as mentors, that might have had a skewing effect. So subsequent research will definitely let us know more. But thanks, that's a great question.
Jet Games asked, can we get a list of sources that you reference in the study, specifically the games that you're speaking of?
Yeah, absolutely. I would be happy to. What would be the best place for me to share that? I'd be happy to provide a list. There's so much interesting research that's been done, and I can certainly also include some games as well. So yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
Sure, send us
That's
the
quite
PDF and
a
I'll put it up with these.
Yeah, absolutely. Will
And
do.
Robin Coleman generally is happy to stick around. So if you're in the GGDA, you can jump in the voice channel